Really? Okay, fine. I like Type Moon content, casually as I am in regards to it.
Type Moon is a visual novel developer in Japan, the company named after a certain character in their games and content that's collectively known as the Nasuverse, a collection of stories that all share the same continuity, or at least a sect of the multiverse with a standard set of rules and settings shared between them. The franchise is huge, adapted into various forms that, a lot of which we've not seen imported, but has slowly trickled over both in official form or through fan translation, and in Japan it's one of their largest selling franchises, actually competing with some of Japan's great long runners. Hell, its mobile game incarnation that's actually the focus of most of the story content expansions, Fate Grand Order, is actually year over year in the top 10 most profitable mobile games worldwide, to say nothing of the merch it puts out and sells out of, or its numerous anime adaptations of their stories that are almost all engaging watches. Though unfortunately a lot of the anime has been imported by Aniplex US, meaning people can't actually afford the sets due to their price gouging. That is assuming they wanted them in the first place, considering several of their dubs, well, suck. Still, with how much it's here and been super popular, that's not bad for a company started by a pair of people, main scribe Kinoku Nasu and illustrator Takashi Takeuchi, that began their work as just wanting to make erotic fantasy stories.
Thing is, the pair who have been friends since middle school kind of tripped into success between Takeuchi's super appealing and diverse character design, his preference for extra curvy waifus and saber faces notwithstanding, garnering him extreme otaku appeal, on top of Kinoku Nasu's unique style of storytelling, prose, character exploration, and penchant for deep, complex lores, getting a lot of people on board their content hard and fast, with how they make nearly all of their cast of characters appealing and memorable, and what they go through rather distinct. While their first noted work was Kara no Kyokai in 1998, and actually also the true root lore story called Notes, that everything is eventually feeding into, that actually deals with the war with the titular types on a ruined Earth, well, both basically act as a prototype for their later successes, which would come first to really be defined by the titular visual novel Tsukihime, released in 2000.
For those not familiar with visual novels, they are stories told in game form, where you play through a collection of cinema cutscenes that on occasion have a choose-your-own-adventure dialogue option that opens up different paths for character interaction and exploration. They've gotten a bad rap over the years, mainly as they are rather static games where the most you see are stationary character sprites over a static background, unless you unlock a static wallpaper cutscene. And unfortunately, a lot of them are unimaginative romance erotica and porn games, where you pick your waifu by talking to them constantly like a stalker, until eventually you unlock a sex scene. Such a process completely overriding focus on any larger story you could potentially have with the setting involved, and thus few writers of the format really care all that much for the setup beyond creating an excuse plot.
And while it would be disingenuous to say Nasu and Takeuchi's works are devoid of that, as choosing a waifu for the main character to romance actually does play a part in seeing varying elements of their stories and settings. This is actually Alexis, I just pulled it off of one of her shelves. And there is erotica elements part of that story progression. Frankly, the romance arcs of their stories fall into the backdrop as the characters, lore, and setting remain in focus throughout and don't end up overshadowed as other eroge or porn games would have happened. The pair are considered revolutionaries to that genre as it made replaying their games in their entirety through all the routes extremely enjoyable and entertaining, as it wasn't about picking a waifu anymore and not caring about everything else for a visual novel player, but about truly seeing, the merits of the build world and how the characters' interactions with their world can save it or damn it and their love interests of choice. It's like the BioWare decision wheel, but on steroids, as it remembered to focus on making choices that culminate and matter.
And with Fate Stay Night in 2004, a game and anime series I have infrequently made mention and reference to before on my show, they hit the literal jackpot and became super popular, defying all the problems of the format. That story, about a ritual that summons the spirits of legendary heroes through time to battle with modern-era mages, for the right to collect the energy of the other fighters to power a reality-warping wish, and the boy that's dragged into it named Shiromiya, who just wants to save people due to the calamity he lived through tied to the last time the ritual was performed, and is one of the best of its little sect of modern fantasy stories. While it is part of a clique of series originating in influence from the Japanese novel and film Battle Royale, it entirely eclipses competitors like the Trashfire series Kamen Rider Ryuki, and even the original novel itself, by how it gives weight to its events and story, turning literary standards of the hero's journey, the expectations of a successor hero to a bestowed legacy, and the arc of a sacrificial hero, and entirely upends them, being a simultaneous deconstruction and reconstruction of that type of hero and tale, with its point-counterpoint debate of its merits, fantasy, the cost of false ideals, and blind recklessness, but never coming off as cynical to the simple desire of a person that just wants to help those around them to live their best life.
How glorious and well-crafted Fate Stay Night is throughout its multiple distinct story routes and expansions cannot be understated, and actually is a big reason why I can't stand most other Battle Royale series, as it does such a thorough job justifying its story, setting, and cast, while throwing up a middle finger to anyone that makes those stories just create a situation to kill off cannon fodder and make flimsy excuses to have an asshole Gary Stu protagonist, that most others just do not compare, and find a far weaker story as a result than I would have without context to it, as if they are all justification excuse plots to see characters fighting because of common powers and skills, as opposed to actually using everything a person has ever been shown capable of doing to give actual meaning, menace, and advantage in a fight for actual tension. If you've ever watched the web series Death Battle, Fate's basically that, but for mythological heroes and modern mages of various skill sets, and it's good as it really does show how much Nasu did their damn research and justified their divergences from expectations of those works, the exploration of character, to then validate what follows in the interactions, bouts, and conflict. There is a lot of thought that goes into their works. And that continues to be reflected in the current incarnation of the Fate franchise, Grand Order, which expanded their magical servant summoning ritual and system into a much larger story that spans the breadth of space, time, and their own works of lore that tie all of mythology together, even with some of their idiosyncrasies thrown into the mix. Case in point, Nasu and Takeuchi's commonplace habit to gender-bend historical and mythological figures to play with the possibilities inherent to such a divergence. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Empress Nero, King Arturia Pendragon, in both embracing their femininity and struggling with gender identity issues variants, Jailbreak Jackie the Ripper, and of course, Leonardo da Vinci, who chose to be summoned as a magical servant in the guise of his most famous portrait, the Mona Lisa. She has magical thighs, you know. I honestly could go on, but playing up that kind of fanservice-y warrior and yet manage to do it seriously and make the persona of the individual more valued than their appearance is no easy task. Like, there is a reason there is an impossible-to-win debate over who's the best girl of the original Fate story, to say nothing of the expansion content once you get to the Clock Tower cast.
But that swings us back to Tsukihime, the unfortunately neglected big sister in the whole Type Moon Nasuverse. Tsukihime, alongside two other stories, was actually the start of most of the magic and world concepts that would be seen in the Fate side of things, and was also very popular and put them on the map as story writers. However, from my understanding from those who've played fan translations of the game, it's a lot more rough than the first parts of Fate Stay Night, which explains why it actually has taken them years to revisit, even though its lore is still occasionally referenced or expanded upon in the Fate side of things. And the anime that Alexis has asked me to cover did not help things at all.
According to Konoku Nasu, the reason why it took them so long to do anything more with Tsukihime, because they announced they were finally releasing the game's remake literally as I was writing the script, and by the time this video gets out, it should be either already released or close to releasing. So, hey, timing the review for me. Is simply because they were having too much fun writing for Grand Order, with them also saying that when it does get out, they hope to also write the sin that was this original anime production. And you're probably wondering what is wrong with it. And to that, we have to dive a bit into how they handled the Fate Stay Night adaptation, in that they split the visual novel into 3 distinct anime series: the Fate route, the Unlimited Blade Works route, and the Heaven's Feel route, all adaptations of the 3 story routes of the original visual novel, which all had multiple distinct story routes decided by the chosen romance option. It allowed them to flesh out each story individually, and each story builds off the other so you know more about the world. And the adaptation for Tsukihime did not choose any story route to adapt. No, JC staff who developed this anime chose to amalgamate all of these routes it has into one by hack-jobbing pieces of the secondary routes into the main two paths that then make one, and you can't do that without Kinoku Nasu write stories! Like, considering how they fucked up a certain Magical Index Season 3 and One Punch Man Season 2 the exact same way, this seems to be a horrifyingly bad recurring problem with them.
The thing about Kinoku Nasu is, much like myself and how I always end up overblowing the size of these reviews, is they are very verbose. If they want to take the time to expand on story elements and character through dialogue and interaction, they take that time and then some. The Fate storylines are very long and distinct from each other because of it. Actions a character takes have tangible weight in causing divergences that have consequences. While some of that can be pared down by animation enabling visual storytelling to shortcut character feelings and interactions to give up the cliff notes, that only works for so much due to the very differences. It is why the original Unlimited Blade Works movie, despite getting everything important, actually pales in comparison to the 26-episode adaptation of the story that more let it breathe. And Heaven's Feel was adapted into a movie trilogy equivalent to 18 normal anime episodes. You cannot condense their stories into less than that and make them work. Hell, the Fate adaptation produced by Studio Dean, colloquially known by fans as Dean Stay Night, actually recognized that they could not do their adaptation of the Fate route in less than 16 episodes. And that's the other reason why they did what they did in amalgamating elements of Unlimited Blade Works that didn't conflict with the Fate route into it to expand the story just in case they never got another chance at it.
Tsukihime's anime got 12 episodes. It's like, I don't even need to explain more than that to tell you how badly they fucked this up.
But what is Tsukihime actually about? Well, it's about Shiki Tono, a boy who after an incident as a child gains the magical power of the mystic Eyes of Death perception, which allows him to see and cut metaphysical lines that cause things to break or die once struck. Rendered an outcast because of his lack of understanding over his new power despite being given glasses that conceal it by a traveling mage, Shiki grows up isolated and alone, until the point in high school after a series of brutal vampiristic murders, he encounters Arquade Brunstead, the titular Tsukihime. Arquade is what is known as a true ancestor, a type of royal vampiric entity that is naturally born, and the last of her species. Worshipped as a goddess by both normal vampires and their magical equivalents, the undead apostle ancestors who know true reality-warping magics that make them an extreme threat to the world when they bother to get involved in it.
And if that sounds a bit convoluted, well, there's a problem I kind of ran into with this. I'm not that familiar with Tsukihime and have little to no first-hand knowledge, just what I absorbed reading the very detailed Type Moon wiki for hours and hours on end when I first got into the Nasuverse thanks to watching and enjoying the Dean Stay Night, Fate Stay Night anime. Of course, I know of Type Moon deep lore like the Undead Apostle Ancestors, the Types, what's up with the Eternal Troll Zeltrech, and Magical Girl Prisma Ilia, but as a filthy casual to it, I don't play Grand Order. And while notes, Kaoru no Kyokai and Tsukihime form the basis of a lot of Type Moon's lore that the Fate stuff is cohesive to, I'm not engaged with a lot of it, and this is the second major fault of the anime. The hypercondensation of everything Tsukihime's anime does make it so it doesn't explain itself. It just rams you through it and through story points without context to their value, nor are they placed at points where they actually matter. Again, the reason why some people have trouble getting into Type Moon content is they really do spend a lot of time explaining and expanding on their lore, so it does all make sense and is well delivered so you can understand and internalize how it works naturally with time and exposure. But it's difficult to abridge it with how dense it is. If I were to do it myself, I would need a .hack retrospective-sized retrospective for it, or someone would need to do The Basics of Type Moon series, similar to what Chris McFeely does for Transformers. And unlike some more clickbaity YouTubers out there that just write off the franchise as too confusing to get into, it's not. It really isn't. It's just, there is a high barrier of entry caused by all the deeply developed lore to it. And you have to enter it from the beginning of a sect of it, join at one of the created jumping on points, or do what I did and spend days reading the wiki. So, upfront admission, I might get some lore details wrong in accident. But I checked what I could, and at least I'm trying to explain what is essential to the plot, which the anime didn't. It didn't even try.
Like, just an additional expansion on the true Ancestor thing, they are a race created by entities called either Ultimate Ones, or more colloquially in the setting, Types. All Types are entities that are physical incarnations of world souls, and the ultimate enemies of everything in the Type Moon universe, as nothing human can really kill them through conventional means. The Type named Crimson Moon, who is the incarnation of the moon, created the true ancestors as physical incarnations of acts of natural disaster, which Crimson Moon made as a means to control humanity on behalf of Gaia, a manifestation of the Earth's will to survive that is one part of Type Earth. The true ancestors, however, ended up creating the undead apostle ancestors by feasting on magical humans, and they in turn created normal vampires. That's why vampires all worship them.
There's actually still even more of this to address, particularly tied to Arquade's archetype Earth existence that can allow her to incarnate as a new Crimson Moon, or vessel for the spirit of the Earth. But the anime doesn't give you the time to properly have exposure or explain any of this. If I didn't know Type Moon Deep lore, I'd have no context to that at all, but the scene of that would just seem pointless to include without that, as nothing ties back to that. But look how much I had to explain to make that problem explicable.
But yeah, what Arquade represents is important, as upon Shiki meeting her, he kills her almost effortlessly. But because she's an Ancestor-level vampire, well, Ancestors are very, very hard to kill in the Nasuverse because they are an inhuman, inconceivable existence. So she just gets better at the cost of draining some of her power. As another thing about magic in the Nasuverse is there's a unique reasoning about why it's not widespread. Magic is by its very nature mysterious. It is most powerful when someone doesn't understand it, but as understanding of it grows, it becomes less mysterious, and thus loses its power. Mages of the modern era are thus a fraction of the power to ancient ones, where maybe only a person or their family had great power or abilities that, as more people learned them, people could only utilize a fraction of that potential power. Reconstructing the power scene of gods or myth is thus impossible, as while many may now know the process to forge them, the result is thus weaker. But because humans don't truly understand the types or ancestors or vampires, that's why they continue to have immense power. And why over in the fate side of things, that's why the various summoned servants are so beyond humans in skill, as they originate from eras where the mysteries still lived. Thus their power isn't quite explicable in the modern day. Or in Shiro Emiya's case, his own existence has become so distorted from that of regular humans that he isn't fully understandable by others. Thus, that distorted worldview and mystery even to the truth of himself allows him to access and mimic power vastly beyond him, which actually makes him more similar to an ancestor than that of the powers held by heroes of legend. But that is also why Shiki killing Arquade doesn't quite stick, as his mystic eyes of death perception only allowed him to kill the mortal self connected to Arquade. But she isn't mortal, nor like other vampires his powers otherwise would work against.
And again, the anime doesn't explain any of this. It doesn't give time for itself to explain. So a lot of scenes that might be meaningful and important to the story of the game have no context or purpose being here. I'm spending 3/4 of this review providing context required to make the story work that the anime itself doesn't. It's the same problem as, like, Sunrise and any Japanese company making a compilation movie for a product. There is so much that is important to telling the story and presenting the characters that the condensed form of it doesn't work as its own entity. You might as well go and engage with the original incarnation of it as if you don't, you'll get the wrong idea of what the content is supposed to be. It is like the failures of the Code Geass movie continuity changes, excluding the actual story, character, and relationship arcs of it to benefit the post-canon movie decisions that they don't work at all, but on steroids. I really don't like the Code Geass movie timeline. I will explain later.
And that on steroids bit is all in how the anime actually somehow finds a way to drag itself out in ways that baffling makes it devoid of content. It makes itself more about creating an atmosphere for these events than actually presenting them. And considering this is a hypercondensation of multiple story routes, that it then doesn't even spend time presenting those routes in story makes it all the more frustrating. It spends time with Shiki doing common everyday tasks and not getting to the damn point. So those everyday scenes entirely crowd out presenting the material that matters and would justify the story. Minutes are wasted on him going to school and doing everyday common tasks instead of introducing cast relevant to the tale. It is literally 10 minutes into the first episode until the plot gets going, which, again, would be fine if this were a 24 to 26 episode adaptation of one route, or even amalgamation of multiple routes, but not a hypercondensed version of all the routes into 12 episodes, as then, every minute you don't spend on something important is just a waste of time screwing you out of content that would matter.
Like, I have seen series where episodes of it are one long fight scene where nothing but fights happen. No story advancement, no character advancement, no worth in that episode existing at all to the plot, as that then acts as the worst kind of filler imaginable. Which is especially worse when it's the main writer of the show doing it instead of working to advance their story. This is that same type of worthless meandering, but from the opposite angle, where it spends too much time dwelling on the mundane that is absent of any importance. There's something to be said of making sure your story is grounded, but that grounding requires you establish what is possible within your setting, not on everyday nonsense anyone would do or live with. Like, for fuck's sake, they animate Shiki latching his book bag onto his desk. I have, in over 2 decades of watching anime, never seen that in any series I've ever watched, because it's a useless waste of animation and content time that can easily be shorthanded and implied without animating him doing it due to the location he is in, and as slowly as they do.
Made worse is that the wasted time doesn't just crowd out events, but justification in the story. Shiki killing Arquaid? Yeah, it goes from him seeing her to him splattered with and standing in a pool of her blood, without any reaction to his actions on his part. Connective story tissue? What's that? Then it doesn't bother to follow up on that, instead sending us over to a flashback that gives context to another character that has not even been introduced yet. It can't stay focused on just one thing, but jumps around due to how poor the route amalgamation is. If you're gonna have your main character kill someone not long after they're introduced, then at least have the courtesy to explain why they decided to do it, even if it's just an unusual feeling they have. Following that, the first episode descends into even more distractions, as Shiki is reintroduced to his younger sister Akika as he moves back in with her after their parents' death, and they have a slow dinner conversation that matters nothing to the story. And while in a visual novel such a conversation works for establishing characters and setting, that can be done in more expedient ways in animated form. While Akiha and Shiki's family and their history is a part of the story, the shape of their familiar relationship and them being estranged for years is dealt with horribly like this, as this scene establishes jack all that would tie into that arc, and it dwelling on it is again a frustrating distraction, as it doesn't get you back to why Shiki just killed someone, which is a bit more of an important matter.
Shiki's character is actually harmed the most through this presentation as well, as he's just being forced through chess piece storytelling from scene to scene with no actual agency to help define him for the audience or why we should care about him. We have no insight into him. He just goes places to interact with people that we have no supplied grounding with which to define them or their relationships, thus making it so we don't care or form attachments to anyone, especially with how passive Shiki is in each of these encounters where he doesn't even really engage in conversation with them, just be talked to. Which is made worse by the fact that Shiki in this anime is made to literally repeat the most recent sentence in a conversation that was just said to him to fill time. Like, this happens on occasion in anime and visual novels and even light novels, when a character is mulling over or is in disbelief in what they were told, so repeats something just said to mull it over. But it is present in nearly every conversation Shiki is a part of for a large portion of this series. And it's again a case of the adaptation wasting time when it has no time to actually waste.
To give context to what's actually going on here, while Tsukihime has 5 routes, there's actually technically 6 stories divided between 2 groupings, the near side and the far side of the moon routes. The near side of the moon routes are focused around the characters of Arquaid and the vampire hunter Ciel. It is here that the primary focus for Arquaid and the vampires is placed, as they and Shiki try to track down the vampires and their thralls that are assaulting people in their town.
The third near side route, however, that brings the total up to 6, is one that actually got cut from development in the original game, with it being focused on the character of Shiki's friend, stalker, and fledgling vampire, Satsuki Yumizuka, who in the near side routes ends up killed either by Arquaid or Ciel after she was turned with Shiki none the wiser, or in the far side route survives long enough to have a crisis of identity and come in conflict with Shiki as she wants to die before she truly becomes a monster. I mention this as Kinoko Nasu has said that he wants to restore the Satsuki route if a Tsukihime remake ever comes to fruition, and hopefully will be part of the game that's releasing soon, as it is important for our purposes in explaining Tsukihime's story, as, well, Tsukihime does have some sequel content, and the story/game Melty Blood directly follows from Satsuki's non-existent route. But the presumption about that route has always revolved around the possibility of Shiki helping Satsuki to retain or regain her humanity, as the story of Melty Blood implies there may actually be a cure for vampirism.
Then there are the far side of the moon routes, that are focused around Shiki's sister Akiha and the Tono family's maids Kohaku and Hisui. The far side routes explore the dark side of the Tono family and their ancestral sins, as they are actually a family descended from demons that, like the true ancestors, are naturally occurring in this world as a means of suppressing humanity's development, and have over time interbred heavily with the Japanese population. The Tono family's members have a long history of being afflicted with the phenomenon known as inversion impulse, a blood trait of those who bear non-human blood that has the instincts of their inhuman sides override their abilities to reason. With the Tonos, as they bear the blood of Oni within them, inversion impulse commonly manifests as a second personality that is murderously insane, their normal selves seeing visions of the actions their others commit, and thus surround themselves with those of supernatural ability in hopes of suppressing their malicious impulses and superpowered evil sides, to the detriment of those then tasked with keeping them chained. Both Kohaku and Hisui having suffered severe abuse from Hakia's father, and now from the Tono siblings.
However, and here's the big twist that takes forever to be revealed in this version that is apparently hinted at and foreshadowed in the visual novel, but not here. Shiki is not a born member of the Tono family. He was adopted into it, thus does not have the inversion impulse blood trait. No, that trait is held by Shiki Tono. That Shiki, spelled in all caps when put in English to distinguish the two as, while they share a pronunciation, the kanji used to symbolize the spelling of their name is different between them. All caps Shiki Tono is the antagonist of the far side routes, and is in a split personality relationship with his own inversion impulse incarnation that serves as the antagonist of the near side routes. Michael Roa Valamjong. I believe I'm mispronouncing that last name, but I don't really care right now. Who is himself an undead apostle ancestor that figured out how to manipulate reincarnation in order to become a pseudo-immortal. And immortality in the Nasuverse is a big deal, and something no one in any sect of the setting at all wants anyone at all to gain. Thus, anyone trying to is given a kill-on-sight designation, and even those who gain it by accident through no action of their own are thought of with hate and disgust, and distrust. As gaining it is a mystery that needs to remain unknown to ensure the functioning of the literal universe itself. You can be near unkillable all you want, but you still need to have some weakness.
So Shiki killing Arquaid as he did, yeah, that's a misdirect for the inversion impulse. As the reality is, Shiki is from the monster-slaying assassin Nanayak family, whose own blood-borne ability drives them to instinctually attack the weak points of those of inhuman origin. That history, presumably, is how Shiki actually gained his Mystic Eyes of Death perception. It can be seen as a special ability tied into his lineage, awakened when his original family was murdered by All-Cap Shiki and Akia's father, Makihisa, and turned on permanently when All-Cap Shiki first went Inversion Impulse and tried to murder his siblings as Rowa. However, when All-Cap Shiki awakened like that, their father tried to put the genie back in the bottle, and failed spectacularly, and causing Shiki to lose part of his life force and mentally tampered with, so he has memory issues. At least, I think, as that is the only way that would explain the story's decision to depict him as jumping around between moments and becoming confused regularly by things happening that he doesn't remember. Because that disappears over time in the story, I would presume rapid repeated exposure to the supernatural would drop that blinder from his mind. But there's no real context to that in the anime adaptation early on, without choosing to use jump cuts, Shiki repeatedly stating confusion, and characters interacting at a distance from him as if he's the problem. And again, the series slowly dwelling on each event as it happens with this limited runtime does not help itself, as there's more that should be here, but the pacing removed the opportunity for it to be included.
It's like when I savaged Dot Hack Roots in 2014 on how it focused on everything but what its story should have been about showcasing, but in this case, solely through the means of it not understanding how to pace the adaptation of the story and what is important to stay focused on, and avoiding the action scenes needed to validate the story's events and its conflict resolution. Because I already recapped what was relevant to the story's first half several minutes ago, as they made the rest of what happens intangible and value as they remove the context needed for the story to work.
Anyways, yeah, after killing her, Arquaid comes back, and is so impressed by what he did in killing her,
because Arquaid, when not weakened or restrained, is the single most powerful character in the Nasuverse, only rivaled by Primate Murder and Shiki Ryogi from Kara no Kyokai. Yes, multiple characters share the same name in Type Moon. It does get confusing.
that she wants his help while she finishes recovering her power from the resurrection in hunting down vampires behind the murders in the region that are drawing attention to themselves. As here's another bit of brilliance that is Konoko Nasu's writing. They do not write characters and powers upon an ever-ascending lensman's arms race, but instead create powers and abilities that follow a rock-paper-scissors dynamic with each other. Arquaid, due to her immense power, cannot be killed by normal means, but she can be weakened to the point she can no longer exist in this world. Rowa, in his first incarnation, having done just that and stole half her power, and she's lived since then primarily to hunt him down when he reincarnates, and is stuck sleeping her existence away to restore the power she has left when he's not. And Shiki killed her with no effort due to his mystic eyes of death perception. It just didn't stick, because he cut the wrong line of her life and she could heal herself from the damage it did. Other vampires don't have that gift. Or rather, it is to say it's a lot more inefficient that how Shiki killed Arquaid, cutting her into 17 pieces, would actually do the job. But moreover, the one she is hunting, Rowa, his reincarnation ability is a massive problem, as Arquaid is actually seeking to destroy all of the other ancestors, as she has since the 12th century, which she can't do as long as Rowa can reincarnate into a new form that over time will allow him to overcome her. But if Shiki uses his power to cut the connection his soul has that is manipulating the wheel of reincarnation, then he's going to die for good. And the journey to achieving that is the endgame of the near side of the moon route, Arquaid enlisting his service as recompense for Shiki wasting one of her deaths and weakening her. That thus draws them into orbit of one another to begin their romance arc, and potentially set off the others.
Oh, and another outright failing of this anime's adaptation. It is very, very terrible at how it handles the romance arc for everyone. Just everyone. It presents the characters as having little to no chemistry at all. mainly falling into their shipping orbits because the plot says so. And that's not normally how a Kanoko Nasu romance story reads. Like, there is a legitimate reason why fans of the Fate series cannot decide on who is the best girl among the options of Arturia Pendragon, Rin Tosaka, or Sakura Mato. And why a lot of fanfiction writers for the franchise just decided to go, screw it, harem ending.
そうだ悩んでいても仕方ないおお多少無茶でも計画通り全員とのデートを成立させるのみだみんなを幸せにするんだ
We joke, but considering how common harem anime are these days, it's not that far out of reason, especially with Nasu and Takeuchi's origins writing Eroge. But again, a point to them, it probably would end how it does in Carnival Phantasm.
まさか言い逃れしようだなんて思ってはいないでしょうね
随分と気が多いよねつまり八つ咲きになりたいってこと
Fortunately, this anime adaptation is smart enough to recognize Arcade as the main heroine of the story, and thus the true romance option for its events to revolve around. Thus, as we move into the subsequent episodes, Shiki and Arcade finally interacting, as a means to explore the other routes, does begin. But the pacing still makes this pursuit rather stagnant, Arcade taking minutes to expound upon every cut that cut her from his one slice and example. Again, lifted from the games, but forgetting that pacing is important, and you got only half the time you needed to justify doing things this way, and it thus takes 10 goddamn minutes of more meandering to get to the point, when they're attacked by demon dogs that Arcade just smashes, and not even on screen. These are the servants of another apostle ancestor, Nero, who fused himself with 666 familiar spirits, but split his soul between them for his own means of pseudo-immortality.
Which also made all of them, though empowered beyond normal beasts, rather weak by Nasuverse standards. Like, for comparison purposes, there is another ancestor named Marine Solomon, whose 4 limbs all contain one familiar daemon who possesses the abilities of a Morphic Master of Rats and Plagues, a Wind-Up Doll Weapon of War, a Great Manta Ray that can even travel into the depths of space, and a black dog that contains the power of natural disasters given form, respectively. Each is formed from the concept of an absolute, thus they are insanely powerful, which makes up for the fact that their creator is physically weak and frail by vampire standards. There is another named Fina Blood Svelton that is basically Alucard from Hellsing, consuming the souls of every warrior or soldier he's ever killed and absorbing their weapons of war, and summoning them as their own personal army that grows infinitely more massive with time, and has the ability to summon them or himself back from the ghost ship he commands should their physical form be destroyed, and also summon back to the ghost ship should that be destroyed. You see Nero by comparison, and while he's got a lot of pets, they're not exactly reaching either extreme of pacifying the powerful, nor raising a city to ash.
Honestly though, Nero's a good starter antagonist for those new to Type Moon with such an esoteric ability. He just fails in comparison to the greater power curve the series' expanded lore operates under, which is not helped, again, by how slow their actual fight is. 'Cause I've not done anything to this footage beyond cutting it so I don't get content ID flags. One of his wolves clamping down on Arcade does actually take that long. The same with the slow drip of blood, and it's a repetition of the same problem. The anime development team focusing on atmosphere over story pace, and it harms the result horribly, and it doesn't sell the ancestors as unstoppable creatures, but little more than a plotting slasher villain taking their time, and without any of the menace you'd get from a Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees type.
Now, there is a standard cinematic technique in Japan that calls for an individual who is powerful to slowly move towards an enemy and the action slows down around them to emphasize their menace. However, that technique is usually called upon in instances where that slow walk has them tanking and countering literally everything that is being thrown at them. As if to say, I don't need to move fast, I'm going to destroy you all the same, and there's nothing you can do about it. It is a commonplace staple to works that feature giant monsters or robots. The power of them just walking is impactful upon the audience by how much just them moving affects everything around them, and yet nothing affects them. That doesn't work with the guy creating beasts from his body that are supposed to be fast and agile hunters. And then the beasts are slow to attack, and the ones they're attacking that are supposed to possess power beyond human limits are just as slow to react and respond as a normal human. They're not doing a very good job of selling them as monsters that way, just compounding the pacing problem where even that's supposed to be action scenes aren't speeding up anything. Like, Buffy the Vampire and its spin-off Angel were still on at this time, and they got this right!
But by Shiki choosing to turn and run instead of fight Nero, a hotel full of people are slaughtered. Shiki made fully aware of those consequences by regular news reporting. They spend the daytime of the next day recovering, before confronting Nero again, and in Arcwade's weakened state, ends up falling for Nero dismembering himself so he can turn his limbs into more beasts, which restrains her in a showcase of Nasu and Takeuchi's eroge impulses.
Actually surprising to see from them. They usually avoid bondage and the illusion of tentacles, with exception to Gilgamesh's Enkidu chain or when Castor Medea fangirls over Arturia.
なんとしても彼女だけは捕獲せねばならないわ。
おかえり。
あら、セイバー。キャスターがなぜここに？坊やに料理を教えてもらいに。ちょうどいいわ。味見してくださらない？何か入っているのでは？
The fight that follows with Shiki and Nero, as I inferred, is just pathetic, again failing to present these as truly inhuman with the lack of speed behind their actions, making it more seem like empty posturing, as you don't even see Shiki actually cutting him. Like, anime series, depending on who their audience is intended to be, can be pretty damn graphic in their violence. A great modern example of that being the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure or Hunter x Hunter anime, where I could just not look at the screen as what they were showing being done was that grotesque to me.
Oh, and you can also thank Alexis for showing me those. We've had a large number of watch stuff marathons since she and our other roommate John moved in. That's just run the gamut in content and genre. I showed them the Raildex franchise, Star Trek, Red Dwarf, and Persona. We marathoned literally every Gundam series, got a chance to revisit Stargate, tortured ourselves with the extended cut of the Tolkien movies, and John plays a lot of Yakuza. We've had fun when we're not busy with stuff.
But here, this is positively PG in how they explicitly avoid the violence required to sell the action. Thus again, it doesn't have the weight behind it to justify itself. Shiki is supposedly hurt badly by this? Well, where and when was he hurt? We don't see it, we're just told it happens. While that works in a novelization because you're supposed to visualize it yourself, well, animation requires visual storytelling, and skipping the details that are supposed to be right in front of us for no reason does not incentivize us to fill in the gaps like reading a story would. This is where the series abandons the Arcway route for a bit, flipping to the Far Side routes, I think, to more explore Shiki's familial bond with Akiha, Akiha's attempts to reconnect with him, and their servants who he's known all his life, bringing back the suppressed memories of all-cap Shiki, unnerving Akiha at his possible uncovering of the truth they've hidden, and using him as a surrogate for the sibling that went insane to keep herself grounded. However, it turns out killing Nero hasn't dealt with the threat in their midst. Arcwade found the scent of a fledgling vampire created from the prior events that has in turn continued the killing sprees, which were in fact not caused by Nero himself, but the person who hired said assassin Ancestor. There are other thralls beyond this, thus they have to track the thralls back to their true master. However, this is where we see another failing of this adaptation, as while they start name-dropping Roa as their big antagonist, Arcwade is given no scene where she explains who he is after she starts making mention of him, just starting to say the thralls are Roa's servants, and Shiki just takes it in stride as if they already explained it. But they didn't.
And unless I completely tuned out of the story both times I checked to see if they had mentioned him by name before this, they didn't. I admit I might have missed it, but I'm pretty sure I didn't.
But their hunts eventually turned into a series of dates, as due to Arcwade sleeping her existence away between the times Roa reincarnates, Well, she's not been up and about in decades to grow and evolve with the times. Thus, things like movies and video games, they're a new experience for her. And due to the limits placed upon her as both an ancestor and incarnation of the Earth, she treasures new experiences and wants to stay unshackled. But she can't until Roa's dead. The small divergences from their mission, however, are treasures to her, even if they on occasion trigger her vampiristic impulses that she never actually trained herself to suppress like other true ancestors, as she was never originally taught of their danger since she was meant to be the killer of those who would feed on blood indiscriminately.
This dichotomy actually is a large part of her character, as while she's tempted by blood, she is vehemently disgusted by the loss of self-control that results from a true ancestor drinking blood and the atrocities that result from doing so. As, here's the thing about the true ancestors. They literally don't need to drink blood at all, and gain no more power from it than a normal human would in this world. Beyond at least the transfer of life essence and magical energy mages in this setting make use of, they can have them take magical power from another by ingesting their bodily fluids. Yeah, there are sex scenes in Fate Stay Night. Their lust for it is 100% a psychological defect they got from Crimson Moon. But them drinking blood destroys their minds and turns them into rampaging beasts, where they then eat more and more humans, and thus turn them into the apostle ancestors that are cursed with the need to then suck blood to try and restore themselves from what they lost when the true ancestors ate their essence. It is a corruption of their own existence caused by them being cursed in the same defect inherent to both their sires and their creator itself, altering a world order they had no proper dominion over. Even here, vampirism acts as a parasitic existence, corrupting a stable system.
It's at this point Ciel finally enters the story briefly to just tease at her part in things, as she confronts Arquaid on her interactions with Shiki, the True having a long history, as Ciel is actually Roa's previous incarnation.
Wait, sorry. The anime doesn't actually explain that. Despite the episode where their encounter happens, having been named after Ciel's epithet of the bow, which ties into that exact backstory. They are apparently adding in stuff from the other routes, but it keeps being the mundane things instead of the elements that tie the larger story of each route together.
To explain that, since the anime doesn't, Ciel was born with immense magical power that allowed her for a time to resist Roa's takeover in that reincarnation, which let Arquaid catch up to him before he could complete his resurrection that time around. As their battle occurred on the night of the Crimson Moon, when the power of Type Moon's children is strongest, Ciel's original persona was able to survive Arquaid's purging of Roa's essence from her, with her body taken in and restored by the Vatican Church, who in this setting is a monster exterminating faction within this world, and she was thus trained to exterminate monsters as well. However, due to her being the 17th, though incomplete, incarnation of Roa, she gained a damaged form of immortality and some of Arquaid's power, and she is unable to truly find rest as long as Roa's reincarnation cycles continue. This thus makes her both an ally and enemy of Arquaid's, as they both have the same goal of wanting Roa stopped for good, but cannot stand being in the other's presence due to what they represent to the other, the one responsible for their curse and why they lost everything, and a constant haunting specter of shame at one's own repeated failures. When really, they both want this cycle to end.
And no, the anime does not get into nor even alludes to Ciel's obsession with curry, not even as a background detail.
It's unfortunate that they couldn't spend time on addressing that, and instead once more shifting to small talk shenanigans with Akiha that ultimately leads nowhere beyond showing that Shiki really does nothing to explore their own familial damage. Eventually though, Shiki escapes his home to find Arquaid, worried about her running off as she did, only for them to end up attacked by more vampires, one using the guise of one of his schoolmates. I'm actually surprised the story didn't make use of the Satsuki elements here to actually have the prior time spent with her have some role and impact. But it's clear by this point this adaptation really doesn't seem to know what it's doing or what parts of the story it wants to amalgamate into itself in order to do a proper route fusion dance.
Really, it makes me appreciate the Doomsday Knight adaptation of the Fate route. I actually have a copy of it up on my shelf, but it's buried behind my models. As I know many Fate fans dislike how it's not true to the original depiction in the games, if they don't just dislike the Fate route outright. For the reasons I stated earlier for why they did the route amalgamation they did, with intent to expand and fortify the story in the belief they'd not get a second shot at it, are at least more reasonable, and they worked to add more relevant, coherent content to make the entire story work in isolation. The opposite really does seem to have happened here.
With Shiki's nightly endeavors becoming more commonplace, Akiha decides to take a hands-on approach to curtailing her big brother's escapades, leading to her meeting his friends and coming into friction with Ciel due to their natures of a monster hunter and one descended from the blood of monsters. However, as I've said, the anime has given absolutely zero context to this literally blood-driven conflict. Thus, their animosity here is completely inexplicable beyond Akiha possibly having a brother complex for her adopted sibling and not liking that another girl may be attracted to him. And that instinctive conflict only getting worse when Arcway drops in on them to more firmly stake her claim on Shiki's affections. To Shiki's dismay, as the three do nothing but bicker between them.
This immediately tells you why the date everyone planned was doomed to failure from the start.
Their bickering eventually outs Akiha's inhuman roots, but it crosses paths with the continuing vampire crisis, as other parkgoers end up attacked and drained, entering into people's minds the idea that Akiha could be the one who was turned. While under suspicion of being the culprit, Akiha collapses, the maids revealing that this is a predecessor event to her own blood-based powers awakening within her, backed up by Shiki eventually seeing her drink the blood of one of the maids, which of course misdirects Shiki's suspicions and confront all three about the truth they're hiding from him, which is eventually revealed by her showing her own unique transformation, the crimson red vermilion form of the origami caging hair. That is the manifestation of the power of her demonic blood, and allows her to absorb the heat and life force of her own victims. However, she's clear to being both a vampire and Roa's host in their interpretations of things, by a victim being found while Shiki's shadowing his sister, eventually leading him to leave with Arcway to find and fight with All-Cap Shiki, who due to All-Cap Shiki's attack on Shiki as a child, can also share his death perception to kill his victims. But his own magic powers, learned from the family and Roa, permit him to escape, once more with nothing answered nor explained.
I mean, I am, but the show has not been and continues to refuse to.
That seems to finally change with Shiki's injury causing him to flash back to the night of his real family's murder by Makihisa Tono and those he hired to assist him. But this is also badly presented as it does not explain nor give context to what the hell the event even was. When Shiki awakens, he tells Akiha what he's been doing, only to then ask what was up with the other guy.
You called him brother.
That's totally ridiculous. You are my only brother.
And with how the previous scene was presented, there was no way to know nor context supplied that she was talking to or about All-Cap Shiki when she inexplicably went from home to suddenly on the scene deep in town, as it seemed like no time passed between All-Cap Shiki attacking Standard Shiki and her showing up in the midst of that fight.
The maids after this do explain their role in things in suffering to suppress the Tono blood from affecting others, but with only the simplest of explanations behind it. It doesn't really validate their words and explanations as a justifiable circumstance. And it's not. Hisui and Kohaku, especially Kohaku of the two, still suffered abuse. But at the very least, Akiha doesn't do to them what Makihisa did, and Akiha has tried to right many of the wrongs done to them as she found them just as abhorrent anyone would towards the literal pedophilic child rape their father would perform on Kohaku just to calm his own schizophrenic mind.
It's questionable who had it worse, Kohaku and Hisui, or Sakura Mato in these circumstances. And one criticism I will send towards Naso and Takeuchi's work is they really make use of sexual abuse and assault far too often as backstory elements to some of their characters. Or when they're drawing a character from mythology like Medea of Colchis, they did so in part because of primal betrayals they suffered. With the only defense towards it being that in the respective characters' routes, that the consequences of such trauma inflicted upon a person is explored as part of a character arc in trying to get over and absolve themselves of the self-loathing that often results from that experience. which makes it better than 90% of stories that feature it as just nothing else other than something that happens to women, which is what has made so reviled outside of this. It doesn't make it good if you find such an element abhorrent, but it is still better than the common expectation. But of course, that context to Kohaku and Hisui's stuff, it is not provided here.
But that is not the only dark secret. Shiki finally learning of all-caps Shiki, by Shiki discovering the cell all-caps Shiki had been kept in for 8 straight years after his blood began to awaken Roa and he assaulted his siblings. Makihisa being unable to kill his son despite the entity possessing him, and instead sealing him away under the house. Shiki was initially sent away to keep the two Shikis apart, but with all-caps Shiki escaping and murdering Makihisa, there was no longer a need for it. That's why Akya called Shiki back. But as it's revealed in Kohaku's routes, but not here nor in Hakiha's, there was a reason why all-caps Shiki escaped. The abuse Kohaku suffered from Makihisa led to Kohaku eventually being tasked with all-caps Shiki's care in an attempt by Makihisa to rehabilitate his murderous son with a woman in his life. And instead of doing so, Kohaku was the one who actually let him out to murder Makihisa in revenge for what he did to her, with all-caps Shiki then deciding, hey, I'm gonna take revenge on the sibling I tried to kill who ruined my life.
Villain motivations explained in the story? What's that? Asked the makers of this anime adaptation.
Yeah, instead of getting to that, Arcade instead pulls attention away from that by coming by and taking Shiki on a date. Another experience she always wanted for herself, and wanted to share with the closest person to herself she's ever gotten. And in a bit of irony that shows Arcade's sense of humor towards her own race and their legacy, they go to a movie called The Vampire Slayer.
Please tell me that's a Buffy call-out. Maybe in this universe, executive meddling wouldn't have made the Christy Swanson film a complete trash fire than them ignoring the original script of Joss Whedon. Sidebar for the interested, there's actually a comic book version of the film that follows Whedon's original script. It's a lot better than that stupid movie, and directly ties into the later TV series. Though to my understanding, the post-TV show Buffy comics swing towards being trash fires.
They talk again after the film about how unvampire-like Arcade is. Arcade equating it again that not everyone of a race is the same as a stereotype. Her once more emphasizing her disgust over what blood does to her. But again in that abstract as opposed to actually explaining her backstory or reasoning behind her loathing. Just that her mission to stop Roa puts such a toll on her that she can sleep decades away without notice. Besides that, she doesn't want to focus on her inevitable fates, but what can be. Thus why she wants to learn more about the modern day, and Shiki himself along with his life. What's common to him in his world that, if she returns to sleep, she will miss out on.
It's hard to comprehend. How can you take the little time you have and spend it on something that might be useless?
Is that really so bad? Can't it be all right to be useless? It's all right. Just to be alive.
But as the day ends and Shiki considers getting her to meet his friends, Arcade drops the bomb of Ciel being a member of the Church's extermination divisions, having inserted herself using mental manipulation magics into Shiki's life to see if he was the reincarnation of Roa. But since he wasn't, she started crushing on him instead. Arcade does finally tell of how she saved Ciel from Roa before and their common mission now, but it's past the point of really caring as, well, the story has barely paid attention to the larger malice at work with how it's meandered. The tale at this point in its 11th episode finally remembering, hey, we have a plot we need to wrap up soon. Thus, with Shiki's wound reopening, Arcade's suppressed bloodlust threatens to overtake her, only stopped by Ciel intervening and getting her to run so she can suppress those urges again by burning what power she has left.
Try to think of Arcade as a vessel whose size was established from the beginning. With time, the vessel gets filled, retaining all it holds. But then if that vessel were to crack somehow, she has reached the end of her limits.
Ciel explains Arcade's backstory here, and very little of it is given. Of the Moon Princess who slept the world away as a pure being untouched by their temptations, that fell from grace because of Roa, who she was in fact responsible for turning into an undead apostle ancestor, when he tricked her into drinking his blood, and falling into the bloodlust that damned her entire race.
Since then, she sealed herself off from the world, coming out and living only for atonement. For the last 800 years, she has only awakened to chase Roa's shadow. Each time she executes him, then returns to her sleep. She keeps repeating the cycle over and over, never coming in contact with other living beings.
Though short-lived, the reason Arcade fell in love with Shiki is because in the small time they've been together, Shiki has given her everything she's ever wanted. Something she believes she'd never get, as long as Roa continued his cycle of reincarnation. As Shiki searches for Arcade, he catches sight of all-cap Shiki being confronted by Akiha. Akiha attempting with her own powers to capture and end all-cap Shiki, only for that to end in a curb stomp we don't even freaking see. Shiki regaining the last of his missing memories of his youth by connecting the dots.
What just happened? Okay, yes, I know that as Akiha's caging hair abilities drawing the life force out of all-cap Shiki, so forcefully the energy is expelled as heat and flames, but because the anime itself explained nothing of her abilities, someone who hasn't played Tsukihime or read the wiki would not know that. And it doesn't have much context to it, as this encounter is not part of the Arcade route, but from Akiha's. And by comparison, they've done an even worse job of explaining the Farside route's material than those part of the Near side.
We also get some severe discontinuity here by the story then saying it's Akiha that let all-cap Shiki out to kill her father, but the flashback used as evidence for this is of the two when they were little kids, and Maki Hiyasa literally died only a month ago after they're all teenagers.
So, I actually went back and rewatched the scene with the Japanese audio track and subs on, just in case this was the dub accidentally missing context to a scene, as has happened in the past and more is a commonplace problem of the simuldubs or just bad localization teams at Funimation that just do not care about getting story details right. And no, this was a complete fuck up by the anime's writing staff that did not remember when and where in the series continuity Makihisa dying happened. How do you do that? It's easy to just have them show the same scene, but with Kohaku letting him out. You get the same effect of Akiha's despair as she didn't know about that, and it has trusted her and Hisui with the job of making sure she stays sane. That's kind of a big betrayal that would shock someone's show and be a wise amalgamation of the routes this series does not seem to understand.
All-cap Shiki is ultimately stabbed by Ciel, recognizing him as Roa's host, but is ultimately unable to stop him, getting stabbed for her trouble. Fortunately, Ciel's immortal as long as Roa remains, so she's fine, leaving Shiki to just care for Akiha as she finally lets him in on everything, giving up Maki's diary that provides him a Cliff Notes version of the details. All-cap Shiki went nuts when Roa began possessing him, tried to attack Akiha, only for Shiki to intervene and die instead, before being restored to life by Akiha's power, allowing her to transfer some of her own life force to him. Makihisa covered up all-cap Shiki's actions, pretending to the larger world that he died, and switched their identities so no one would look into it. It's just another in a long line of bad decisions by the man. Shiki leaves to try dealing with all-cap Shiki himself, running into Arcade again, who asks him to forget about her and what they've done, as she doesn't have the strength anymore to resist draining him dry.
It broke my heart. The way you looked at me with those eyes back there.
It doesn't bother me when other people look at me like that. But I had hoped that you would never look at me that way.
I'm sorry. You've only just discovered how fun it is to really live, haven't you?
But...
So I can't let you go on doing it alone anymore. Am I just in the way?
If for some reason you hadn't killed me on that day we met, I wonder if things would have turned out differently.
Thinking of imaginary things again? It would have been the same. I'm sure of it.
And then they have sex. This happens in nearly every route of the visual novels Nasu has written. As I said, Takeuchi and Nasu were self-described erotic novel creators. And yet, at least with about half the heroines of each entry, it's really sweet in how they get together, as it's been appropriately built up to as the formation of a loving relationship, and not just an "I grinded to unlock the H scene" moment, as is the condemnation of visual novels by and large. Though, it's probably not helped that in the Fate side of things, they made canon the fact that the tantric and sex rituals happen because body fluids contain life and magical energy that can be transferred to another by, first contact. That can be seen as an excuse plot for such, but is more utilized to examine how the Fate Stay Night protagonists are still uncomfortable with intercourse stage of maturity. Whereas Shiki and Arquade, well, Arquade's literally hundreds of years old and knows what she wants. At the very least, there's a lot more sweet to it than it would be with normal vampires, as, let's face it, there's not anyone out there that should be having sex with an animated corpse.
Arquade is gone by the time morning comes, leaving a note behind to say farewell, and she goes alone to have her final battle with Roa. Shiki tries to follow, Ciel trying to stop him, as others from the church will soon be there to purify Roa from this incarnation, and Arquade has no chance against Roa without properly restoring her own powers. And Shiki refuses to let that curb stomp of an ending happen, not after everything Arquade's gone through and denied herself because of Roa's selfish machinations. Not when he has the power to end it for good. Thus, Shiki intervenes as Arquade's consumed by her bloodlust, and she tears Roa apart, overcoming her own impulses, all for him. But Roa's regeneration pulls him back together, truly incarnating and gouging open Arquade's body, too weak to restore herself. Shiki offers her his blood, but it doesn't work that way for true ancestors. Arquade fading away in Shiki's arms, too late to save her, and leaving him the task of stopping Roa once and for all. And with both of them able to see the death lines, it's a matter of one strike between them, deciding their fates, and also whether Roa will continue his cycle unheeded.
When I look at you, I see someone who should have died 8 years ago.
That's what your vision tells you? Is that all? I know now. There's a difference in what you and I can see!
When did this series suddenly become competent?
Shiki managed to catch him off guard in the rubble of the collapsed walkway, succeeding in cutting out Roa's soul and severing its connection to the Wheel of Reincarnation, so he will never return from death again. Ciel is freed from immortality to live out her life normally once more, Aka is freed from the curse of her family's sins, and Shiki meets again with the woman who gave him the glasses that allowed him to maintain his sanity and not see the path of death all the time. Also, he would know when to truly use his gift, though still uncertain after all this if he protected anything at all. But in the end, there is hope that he will one day see again the woman he loves, for as he returns to his normal life, an echo of Arquade appears to him, having regained enough of her power from Roa's death for her to return to the chamber by which she sleeps, in order to one day rise again. This time, free to live and walk through the world how she chooses. And he will wait for her, no matter how long it takes for her to return, just so they can hold even one last moment together.
It's a promise.
This series is bad. Not the story of Tsukihime, as I keep trying to impress, as that is good, but certainly the presentation of the anime adaptation of it does not carry its merits well at all. And I say without hyperbole that I had more fun checking the wiki entries of the game's story and characters for info about them than I did watching the actual series about them that left most of those details on the cutting room floor, despite how much including them would have made the tale more interesting.
Of any series I've reviewed, I'd honestly most closely relate this anime to Dot Hack Roots, the Dot Hack series that was supposed to be a prequel to my favorite game of all time, Dot Hack GU, but was completely incompetent in serving that role, as it spent near zero time focused on the events, backstory, and character actions that would actually lead into the events of the game series that actually matter to the greater story, which thus never saw the light of day outside of a handful of flashback scenes inside the games themselves that Roots was supposed to fully showcase in full context, but never did, which made Roots entirely worthless in role and inclusion, instead distracting us with characters that matter nothing to the story, and completely skipped over the interactions that would create the empathy required to understanding the main character of that sect of the franchise. And Tsukihime's anime adaptation feels like it's fully the same in that it's a story that makes you uninterested, not just in the franchise or source material, but also Type Moon's larger content library, with how badly it misrepresents it and focuses on not just the wrong details and elements of the amalgamated routes, but screws up depiction of, honestly, one of the few times I've actually liked a romance between a human and a vampire. Yeah, there's a lot of series that do move it forward, but the smart series normally understand that's a doomed romance from the start, so there's little point in getting invested as they either break up, or one will have to die. But by Arkwright subverting the normal mannerisms of vampirism, and Shiki being uniquely capable of defending himself with his abilities against their kind in this setting, both of them setting aside what they should be to just be normal around the other and building something around it is honestly engaging, and I totally get why Tsukihime, the visual novel, was so successful to launch Type Moon's other productions. But the awful pacing of this anime, the prioritizing of atmosphere over event, and the inter-route divergences alongside the terrible convergence of the continuities harmed the whole proceeding, making the story of them falling in love but remorsefully forced to separate by Arkwright's time-awake ending that is just as bittersweet as the fate route of Fate's Day Night, a complete slog to ultimately get through.
Though let's face it, even in this poor version of its events, this is still a better love story than Twilight.
And I'd hate to do another comparison to another game tie-in anime adaptation, but I honestly think had they tried something like Persona 4 the animation, that this would have gone over better. In that anime, they followed the larger arc of the game sequentially, but to address how the developmental relationships mattered to the core themes of the story, they would occasionally pull away from regressing down it to address the side stories incrementally to create a sense of completion and closure. While the routes in Type Moon's games are distinct, they do all share common lores and backstories that should have been given some focus into expanding view on the cast and the root issues involved in these circumstances. Whereas here, it seems like the disjointed way this anime handled the route amalgamation left these various side plots and character stories hanging off limply to the side. The series is clearly meant to be the Arkwright route with some extras thrown in, but the intersections they make upon it serve as nothing more than distractive padding as opposed to adding something of tangible value to the story, as they don't know what to cut, keep, or pace better. I totally see why Nasu, Takeuchi, and most of the Type Moon fandom considers this anime adaptation the black sheep of the media content available, as from what I know of the Tsukihime storyline, it strips out everything good, deep, and nuanced about the Nasuverse's storytelling. It only keeps the most basic dregs that makes the tale seem as if it's nothing more than generic genre fodder, instead of the revolutionary story of its game genre and foundation for far more from talented creators that it is. I can't recommend the Tales of Type Moon enough, but when a parody anime for the franchise does a better job representing the cast, setting, lore, and powers at play, you just have to acknowledge this adaptation was a screw-up and move on.
I hope that Kanoko Nasu's remaster of Tsukihime's story does well, and that this series gets another chance at a more proper anime adaptation than the one it got with the rampant popularity the Nasuverse content has. But I'm not going to be holding my breath in anticipation of it. I just wish that Type Moon's other anime adaptations were behind the highway robbery price gouge paywall that is Aniplex US's home video releases, and that Unlimited Blade Works' dub didn't suck. For more accessible Nasuverse content, the Dean's Day Night anime adapting the Fate arc is available from Sentai Filmworks. While it is flawed and some don't like the Shura Arturia romance and prefer Winter Sakura in that role, it is still a good starting ground for those that want to wade into Type Moon content. Past Dean's Day Night, watch Fate Zero, which is the prequel to the events of all the Fate's Day Night routes, then Unlimited Blade Works to get a grander view of that side of things. And then after that, if you want, Heaven's Feel, before you consider jumping into Grand Order or that series' anime adaptations. It seems like a lot, and it is, but trust me, you'll thank yourself later by going into it that way, as it will give you the broadest, most coherent presentation of the story you will likely to get without just playing a fan translation of the original game. I'm Shinta, and hopefully the Satsuki rod will be in the remake, or the vampire side will play a larger part in Type Moon stories going forward. I would hate for them to be completely forgotten, like they were in Raildex.